thinking a lot about this scripture as it relates to events in our world, and goodness is stronger than evil, and we should owe nothing to each other except the continuing debt to love one another. Jesus reminds us that that faith is the victory that overcomes the world, and that is also reflected in this song from the Faith We Sing, Goodness is Stronger Than Evil. Eric and I are going to play through it once for us, and then we'll sing it together.
From Luke 10. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, oh Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her."
Today I'm going to share with us the second in a series of messages about loving our neighborhoods. It's called No Time for Neighbors. And I have to confess that the last couple of days I've been having grave doubts about the timing of this series of messages, asking us to focus on getting to know our neighbors in our own neighborhoods, connecting with our neighbors. And here we have another week of triple-digit temperatures. Nobody wants to come out of their house in that kind of weather. And so I was thinking, well, this is a dumb time to start this series of messages. I should have waited until November. But nonetheless, here we are. Our neighbors probably won't move between now and November. If they do, there's an opportunity to meet a new one when they move in. You know, one of the greatest barriers to connecting with those living around us is lack of time, or our belief that we lack the time, or maybe that we don't make it a priority of our time. It often seems that my life is spent pulling in and out of my driveway on the way to another church event, a child's event, a doctor's appointment, and now and then a recreational event. And I drive past my neighbors' homes every day, many times, and many of them I don't know or barely know. And when I get home, I'm straight out of the car, into the garage, close the garage door, and then immediately inundated with household chores and family needs. sometimes I muse that it would just be wonderful to be retired. Then I hear from many of you who tell me you're way more busy now that you're retired than when you were working. So I don't know what the answer is there. We're all pressed for time, it seems. Last week I began this series of messages about loving your neighborhoods. I've been reading several books about neighboring and being Christian in your neighborhood. And so I plan to share insights from what I'm gleaning there. Today I'm going to talk about some things that came from a book by Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon. They've written a book called The Art of Neighboring. They're both in Great Britain, so I had to translate the book. And in the third chapter of their book, The Art of Neighboring, they talk about the time barrier to connecting with our neighbors. So today I'd like to consider that. I think it's a timely topic, just about any time, really, to talk about how we use our time. If you take the Great Commandments seriously, to love God with all your heart, and then just as seriously the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, well, you may end up feeling conflicted. I mean, you have relationships in your life already, and they take time. So who among us has ever walked down the sidewalk and found an extra 20 or 30 minutes just lying there to be picked up? How are we ever going to find time and energy for one more relationship, let alone 6 or 8 of our neighbors? Many of us are already challenged to make time for God just once a week. And yet, maybe God is asking you and me to take a step back and ask ourselves if we live at a pace that allows us to be available to God and to those who live around us. Well, does that mean that we should just stop all the other activities we're doing and focus just on the folks in our neighborhood? Well, maybe not. But it does mean that we ought to take a hard look at our commitments and priorities and see if there is space for God and for those living around us. Yes, it's our time problem. We're living now in the 21st century with all kinds of conveniences and time-saving devices that we couldn't have dreamed of in the 20th century, way back that last century. 15 years ago, you would never dreamed that you would be able to make phone calls while riding in your car, send an email while riding in your car while you're making phone calls, and while a voice from a GPS is giving you directions to your destination. Or that you'd be able to see the people that you're talking to on the phone. With technology has come all kinds of hopes of having more time. But that hasn't really proven true, has it? Technological progress tricked us into trusting it, and then it exhausted us. Each new invention and innovation promised to make our lives simpler, easier, time-saving, and many of them have done that. But here's the thing. We've just added more tasks into our lives. And I'm as much a part of this syndrome as anyone else. Technological progress has lured us into believing that we're smarter, more aware, more informed, but technological progress does not translate into wisdom. And here's the lies that we tell ourselves as we race through life. Lie number one: things will settle down someday. Or if I can just get through Wednesday this week, everything will be fine from then on. But you know what happens. There's always another pressing deadline after that. Here's the second lie we tell ourselves: more will be enough. If I can get that latest version, if I can get that latest app, then I can, fix all this stuff. We convince ourselves that just one more purchase or one more achievement will bring us contentment. If I could buy more or do more or be more, then things would be good. How much is enough? Just a little bit more than what you have now. There's always something better on the horizon. Lie number 3, we tell ourselves, well, everybody lives like this. Everybody lives at a frenetic pace, and we need to, keep up with them. But really, that's not true. Not everyone lives like that. There are actually some healthy people out there. And the healthiest person who ever lived was Jesus. He got a lot done, but when we read about him, the word hurried doesn't come to mind. When Jesus said, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full," he didn't mean full in the sense of having a packed schedule. He meant a good and meaningful life. Let me ask you, do you think Jesus would have been upset if the temple service went more than 1 hour? How about this? Imagine Jesus getting a text from someone during the Last Supper. Should he read it? Should he respond to it? What do you think? What would you do? Some years ago, I read a wonderful book. I still have a copy of it by Dr. Richard Swenson, a medical doctor. He wrote a book called Margins, in which he talked about our modern time crunch and how we have little margin or breathing space in our lives. Here's a quote from him. He said, "The clock and Christ are not close friends." Imagine what God thinks of us now that we have so locked into our schedules that we have locked ourselves out of the Sermon on the Mount. Could we afford to walk the second mile with someone given our schedules? We jump at the sound of the alarm clock, but sleep through the call of the Almighty. Life is full of trade-offs. And you know why? We're finite beings. I don't know if you noticed, but I realized again this morning that I'm not God. I don't think anybody else here is God. So we're finite. We're not infinite. So we have limited resources of whatever it is, including time. So life is full of trade-offs. People generally become good, though, at anything for which they have an aptitude or a talent. We know that. But to be really good at anything, it takes repetition, doing it over and over and over again. That's certainly true when you think about great athletes, musicians, as well as those in many other fields. To be good at something, you have to give it time and practice. Well, here's the crux of it. Becoming a good Christian, a disciple, willing and able to follow our Lord's commands, takes time and repetition, just like any other thing in life. Seriously. That means making choices in life that are often trade-offs between one good and another good. If we want to be great neighbors, as we're commanded to love our neighbors, we'll have to say no, actually, to some good things so that we can focus on what is truly important. I know what some are thinking. Well, Pastor, I've taken your words to heart, and so I'm saying no to church on Sundays so I can focus on my neighbors. After all, most of them don't go to church anyhow. Well, I have an answer to that coming up. Numerous times, the Gospels report how Jesus turned aside from his planned agenda to care for someone who seemed to be interrupting him. The blind man, the children who came up, healing an official's daughter, a woman with a flow of blood. Jesus got a lot done. He lived a passionate, purposeful life, but he never seemed to be in a rush. And that's because he stayed focused on the main thing. So here's a clue. We have to be intentional. In this life, we can only do a few things really well. And I think it's a good idea to make certain that one of those things is what Jesus says is most important. Maybe we start to grasp that when we grasp the meaning of that one line in Psalm 90. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Hopefully, as we grow older, we realize that we don't have to sweat the small stuff. If we don't purposefully choose how we spend our time, those choices will be made for us, and we'll just let life happen to us. Well, of course, relaxation time is necessary. We all got to have downtime, but we also have to leave room for meaningful endeavors. In Luke chapter 10, we find the story of Jesus at the home of Mary and Martha. And Martha is scurrying around preparing food for Jesus and his disciples, which her culture demanded that kind of hospitality. When you have guests come in, especially important guests, you got to go all out to serve them. Meanwhile, her sister Mary is sitting in the other room listening to Jesus, just sitting there listening to him. And Martha's all upset that her sister isn't helping her prepare the house and prepare the meal and all that kind of stuff. I mean, how many of you have been there? Come on. I'm the only ones that are doing any work around here. How come nobody's helping with this? You ever been there? And Martha complains to Jesus. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Well, that sounds crazy when you think about it. Martha is getting reprimanded for actually serving Jesus, and Mary's doing nothing. I mean, isn't that what we're all supposed to be doing, serving Jesus? Aren't we serving Jesus with all our activities and everything? But Jesus' point is that we must learn how to say no to some good things so as to focus on what's most important. Service to or for Jesus must begin first with Jesus, sitting in his presence. That's why worship always comes before service. It reminds me of Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians. He says, now eagerly desire the greater gifts, and yet I will show you the most excellent way. And we're all thinking, yeah, I get that, worship and being in Jesus' presence, but there's things to do as though we're the only ones who can do anything, like Jesus can't do anything. Our purpose in life is to love God and love our neighbors. And that may mean we set aside some great things, good things that we can do in order to give some focus to what's most important. Love and hurry are fundamentally incompatible. Love always takes time. And time is the one thing that hurried people don't have. So let's take a look at, as Paul would say, excellent timing. First point, keep the main thing the main thing. It just seems to be a universal truth. If you're in business, if you work for a company, and they start getting distracted by all kinds of different things and forget their core product or purpose, they often go off the rails. It's like that in our lives. Remember from last week, it all begins with loving God with all our might. Everyone needs God time. I said needs. I know that of myself. If I don't have God time, my life doesn't go as well. Last week I said that loving our neighbors begins with loving our Creator with all we've got. Because He is not pushy about His agenda, God is easy to forget. He just waits and waits and waits for us. But then I guess He has all the time in the world. What does He think of our prayers on the run? What happened to be still and know that I am God? Societies and people who have the accelerator to the floor are doomed to become godless. Speed does not yield devotion. Here's the second point, an excellent timing. Avoid time wasters. Develop the art of saying no to things that get in the way of your top priorities. Watching TV, surfing the web, playing video games, they're not necessarily evil. They just don't get you to your top priorities in life. Or watching all those episodes of a certain sitcom or drama TV show. I mean, the networks never send you a thank you note anyhow. So, it might be entertaining. It might be okay for a downtime, but, just avoid wasting time. Number 3, be available. That's probably the most important point. This means being available to God and to others. It's a willingness to be inconvenienced for the sake of others. Most of us quickly fill up our weekends and evenings with needs and errands and activities, but when we leave some margin in our time, we can live with a level of peace that allows our schedules to be interrupted for the sake of relationship building. Margin of time actually exists for the same reason we do, for the purpose of being available to God. What's the number one requirement for serving God? Anybody know? Be available. Saying, yes, God, I'll serve. Available for the needs of the kingdom, for service to one another, for building a community. But it all starts with being in the presence of God. Quite often, the most important thing God has for you in your day is not even on your schedule. Being available to God is a discipline of humility that does not assume that our own schedule is the most important thing, or it is even ours to manage, but allowing God to arrange or rearrange our schedule. God invented time in the first place and reserves the right to set the rules for its use. So I think God values faithfulness over busyness. When we fly across the country and we have to change planes in some cities, say Denver or Chicago, how much time do we leave between flights? 3 minutes, is that enough? Okay, 15 minutes, is that enough? No, I mean, we usually leave a minimum of an hour. So if we make allowances in our travel time, why don't we do it in our living time? Life's a journey. And so we need to take time for what's of eternal value. That's just it, I think. Have we forgotten the eternal perspective? Do we even think about anything beyond our own generation? I mean, I'm just as susceptible to this as everybody else here. We get caught up in the constant barrage of news and information and new consumer goods, and you got to be here, you got to have that, and rush. And it's a challenge to pull away from that and focus on the eternal perspective. I call it the snowball theory. Yeah, I'm not going to think about that. Well, why? Well, that comes under the snowball theory. What do you mean? Well, when the sun burns out, the earth's going to turn into a giant snowball, and by that time, nobody will care. So really, what it comes down to, neighboring really is an art. Loving your neighbor is one of the Bible's most repeated commandments, and it's really the opposite of selfishness, which is the common human practice. Acting in divine love demonstrates that unselfishness is possible and shows a reality that cannot be ignored or denied. Whether your neighbors appreciate you or respond to your love, Jesus' command is still valid. Show love to your neighbor in a practical way. So the important questions to ask ourselves are these. Do I live at a pace that allows me to be available to those around me? Are all of the things I'm doing more important than obeying Jesus' commandment to love your neighbor? You see, God never intended time to oppress us. Time is just God's way of making sure everything didn't happen all at once. We're free to use it. And if we're wise, we will use it with an eternal perspective. Sure, we may make a choice today and then question it later or regret it later, like choosing to start a series on connecting with your neighbors in mid-August in Bakersfield. But there's no one right schedule or program that will tell us how to be good neighbors. It's an art. I mean, think about it. We're all humans after all. We're all a complex mixture of all of our passions and desires and thoughts and feelings and hopes and problems and issues and blah, 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 and beliefs and faith and all that kind of. We're just a complex mixture. So it's an art. Nevertheless, God is with us. We have the power of prayer at our fingertips. When you're unsure, take a moment to be with God and pray. We can make friends for God with our neighbors. It is possible. But you can't love your neighbor well if you live an overscheduled life. Crowded lives produce fatigue, and fatigue produces irritability, and irritability produces indifference. And that leads to perceptions of lack of affection and esteem. We certainly don't want that. When people are too busy, the result is long-term friendships are fewer and neighborhood identities fade away. And we don't want that either. If we wanted that, we'd go live in Silicon Valley, where I used to live. God gave us life. God gave us time. God gave us each other. And God gave us neighbors. Sounds to me like that Jesus is asking us to reorient our priorities and reorient how we see ourselves. Are we driven to complete every task? Or are we free to develop relationships with those around us? For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbors as yourself. Amen. Was that too long?